A new conclusion seems to have become fixed in our political, cultural, moral, and theological landscape. An ever-shrinking narrowness, a tightening dogmatic exclusivity demands now that the foundation of our friendships must be lockstep agreement in the minutest of details on an endless set of topics. And we've all just sort of agreed.
People who are well acquainted with grief need to know there's aspirational categories.
But what if it's not true? What if our most important conversations and relationships can occur on a level beneath our conclusions? What if we can talk freely, creatively, with exploration in our hearts, with improvisation at our core, with human commitment as our catalyst, and with friendship as our guide and our goal?
We have to be constantly aware that what we're doing genuinely is making a world.
Don't Hold Me to This is a cultivation of that sort of conversation, and it's an invitation into the possibility of that kind of friendship. Thanks for being here. Subscribe, follow, leave a like, make a comment if you're listening or watching on a platform where those make sense.
Jeremy, Don't Hold Me to This that title was your idea. That was something that you pitched to me, that you would like to start a podcast. And you wanted the title of it to be Don't Hold Me to This. So I just wonder, I don't know that I ever asked you. I think I just intuited and assumed I knew some of what was behind that, but I'd love to hear you talk out why the name and what went into your thinking about starting this podcast in the first place.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the phrase itself is something that I say a lot just in my normal conversations with my family, with colleagues, with clients in my studio, where I'm wanting to cultivate a space in a conversation where we can have ideas that don't have to be conclusive, that don't have to have the character of like fully formed, hermetically sealed, ready for launching out into the world, but that we can together kind of have room to creatively explore. And I think the thing, at least that I need in order to have that character of conversation, I need to know that that idea that I float is not going to be used against me. That I can have an idea that is a terrible idea, and that we find out it's terrible by saying it aloud, or feels like a terrible idea and I say it aloud and we bat it around and it turns out it's a really good idea. But I need to know that I'm not going to be held to like a standard of conclusiveness in order to feel free enough to say a crazy thing out loud. So that was the idea for the name, because I just use that all the time, because that's what I'm hopeful for, is a space where we can be creative and not self-censor before we say something out loud. But I think maybe bigger than that is, and the reason why I wanted to do this together with you, to have these conversations in a way that was more public, is that I feel like what our cultural and theological and political moment needs is a turning down of the heat and a freedom to occupy a space that isn't so perfectly defined down to all the minutia, to where we can have some areas of agreement, some areas of disagreement, and still stay in the same place, still be in the same circle. I think that what we've been doing over the last maybe 10 years of political and cultural and theological discourse is more and more narrowly defining who gets to be in and who has to be out of whatever particular circle we're occupying, whatever political vision or theological conclusions or whatever. We've been so narrowly defining them that people who used to sit really comfortably near each other in a political a set of political ideas or a set of theological ideas or cultural ideas are now occupying opposite teams, fighting a battle that 10 years ago wasn't a battle. In fact, there's this really wonderful line in a song by Dawes. It's in an album called Passwords.
Now that we're through with formalities, what is it you want to ask of me? I'll answer open and honestly, whatever that means. Finding out that we occupy somebody else's opposing side on the banks of some great divide, two versions of a dream.
And I think the reason why I want to have the character of conversation that you might get from a title like "Don't Hold Me to This" is that I think that we're actually occupying somebody else's opposing sides. Mm-hmm. That we've been told that if you have this set of disagreements in all of the categories that we could possibly talk about, then you can't sit at the table together. You don't have any business treating each other as friends or as allies, that you can't share a life together if you don't share these conclusions. And I just don't think that's true. I hope it's not true, first of all. And I'm fairly convinced it's not true because I've seen it happen in really beautiful ways where we have a rich set of disagreements, but we're willing to listen and understand at least to the point where we can articulate each other's disagreements with authenticity and with a sense that we hear each other in it. And I think that's what I want with Don't Hold Me to This. What I really want to push really hard is we don't have to occupy someone else's opposing sides. That we can have really meaningful and robust conversations that where we don't have to end in the same place and still be together.
Yeah, and as I think that gets extended or maybe gets impacted by our own particular stories, it seems like one of the things that if we allow ourselves to exist in the game of occupying each other's opposite sides, is that what was the phrase?
Finding out that you occupy somebody else's opposing sides.
Opposing side. Is that then what we have to do if we're going to play that game is we have to then tighten up on our rhetoric, our conversational, the places we're willing to go, because we can't say things and open ourselves up to things that would then give agreement to or show some kind of solidarity or agreement with the opposing side, right? And I think that part of what I've benefited from our conversations, and I think one of the benefits of this type of space could be that we're trying to engage in a conversation, an honest conversation, and allow the chips fall where they may, whether it to sound like we've now joined, quote unquote, the other side, the opposing side. That's not in the frame of our conversation. We're trying to actually refuse to have our conversation bounded by that kind of a restriction, right?
Yep.
And I think that comes out of our own personal stories. Our personal stories have especially within a theological space, have put us in places where the theological, the circle drawn around the theological endeavor over against the opposing side has not allowed for us to really be able to articulate what's going on in our own lives and our own thoughts, and it becomes a kind of a space that actually threatens to kill what I would say my own spiritual growth and health, because it says, no, you can't say that. You can't ask that question, because to ask that question is to leave this space that we've said is the right and good and safe space. And I think a lot of the reason that space exists is to define itself over against whatever the opposing side is. So I think the part of what I have found helpful throughout my whole time in ordained ministry were spaces where you could ask questions or say things out loud, and that you might not actually, after the conversation, you might not actually agree with the very thing that you've said out loud, right?
Right.
But to get there, that's just a human learning process. There's nothing unique about that. I think every human on some level learns by saying the thing and going, oh wait, I don't think I agree with what I just said.
Right. That's
right.
Yeah.
I've been in that argument where I'm arguing for a position, and I realize, oh no, I don't think I agree with that.
I don't agree with this. That's right.
That again, that us versus them kind of mentality forces you to just double down anyway, and refuse to find your way to say, you know what, I agree with you. I don't think that's the right way to look at this, or whatever. I guess the question we're teasing out, and what we're sensing in all of this, is that there's not enough spaces where people have the ability have those kinds of conversations where they can say things that later they also have the freedom to say, no, I don't actually agree with what I just said.
At least not in public. I mean, I think these conversations generally happen in the quiet of a corner of a pub or a booth in a coffee shop, or sitting in someone's living room between two friends who really trust each other, and whose relationship is cultivated below their conclusions, that their friendship is something that's deeper than the political affiliations or theological conclusions or cultural decisions they've made. The friendship exists below that. And I think that's wonderful. And I think that's where you and I started. And some of the people that I count as my closest friends are those sorts of people, right? And we have those sorts of relationships. But one of the things that has always characterized all of those conversations is a sense that if any of this gets out, you know what I mean? Like, if any of these conversations make it out into the public, we're in trouble, because in here we hold them with open hands, but out there people hold things with closed hands. And if a soundbite gets clipped out of this conversation without the spirit that's infused through the conversation, then we're all held to something that we don't want to be held to.
So that was another thing I wanted to ask is, how do you, it seems like too that part of what we hope to accomplish in our conversations is, the way I would say it is naming the monsters under the bed and inviting others to consider that it's okay to name the monsters under the bed. Like, what are my deepest fears about life and what are my biggest questions about God and his goodness and his
Mm-hmm.
love?
Mm-hmm.
Um, to actually be able to name those, um, honestly, because I don't know if we all have them. I think we all do. Maybe we're not all aware that we have those kinds of moments of question and
Mm-hmm.
uncertainty and fear and maybe and doubt. And so the issue isn't, that's not the issue. It's what do we do with them? And so it feels like this. I at least think of it in terms of, I want this space to be a space where we can honestly do that from our own experience and story and church trauma and trauma as people who are in the church and Christians, and um, but to do so in a way that's also that's trying to lean into goodness and beauty and truth rather than cynicism. And I'm trying to think, I don't want to put too many negative words out there, because I also don't want to cut people off from cynicism. If it's there, that has still has to have a place to be spoken, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, but I feel like I think about the podcast, and don't hold me to this, is not so much about um uh you know it's not about tearing anything down as much as it is about talking honestly about what's there in a way that's walking a path together that sees the story of God still as an invitation to possibility and imagination and creativity and goodness. What do you think
I
about?
I think that's right. In fact, I was listening to a conversation this morning on my way to the studio, and one of the things that one of the guests said was it was talking about like cultivating the creative lives of children, I think is what the podcast was about. And one of the guests said, we have to be constantly aware that what we're doing genuinely is making a world. We are genuinely making a world.
Mm-hmm.
Tolkien referred to human beings. We're not creators. There is a creator, but we are sub-creators. When we bear the image of God, which we are all doing all the time, it means that we are actually making new things. We're making a world together. And I think what that does is it invites us to pause at least for a moment and to say, like, well, what sort of world do we want to make, and what do we want the character of that process to look like?
Right.
And for me, and I know that other people would answer that in a totally different way, but for me, I want it to feel like richly collaborative.
Mm-hmm.
I want it to feel like we are all allowed to bring ourselves and our gifts into that process, and to know that all of us are contributing something. I also want it to be deeply humble. The sort of where the tension lies is like it is audacious to say we're making a world,
Mm-hmm.
and it's also humble to say I don't know how to do that. We have been given the privilege and responsibility of crafting a world together, and we've been given the invitation to figure it out as we go. If both of those things are true, the kind of audacity to take up the mantle of making a world, and the realization that we're all doing it for the first time. We're all doing it without a kind of manual that tells us here's how all the pieces go together. Making a world is not like making an IKEA table. Then the character.
Making IKEA tables, but
I don't like doing that either. I'd rather make a world, honestly. It's easier. The character of that process needs to be both full of confidence and open to all sorts of revisiting and correcting and changing and shifting, and it needs to be both shot through with confidence and done with totally open hands. But also, I think the audacity exists in having this character of conversation, open-handed, free, improvisational, collaborative, into a space where we have in some ways concluded or been told that the only people who get to speak in public are the experts, and the rest of us just need to keep it down and do what the experts say. Don't speak aloud until your speaking can have the quality of a fully formed conclusion that never needs to change. And to have the opposite kind of conversation into that space, I think takes a lot of ignorance or audacity, or both. Maybe it's both.
Yeah. So where do you see the humility in that as well?
I mean, there's always a risk in saying, like, I'm the most humble person here. So I want to be careful.
Or maybe just the invitation to humility. You could, it's not, I'm not asking you, where we're humble, but I just, just what would you hope for the humility to be in that mix?
For me, what I want, as it pertains to humility, is in the same way that I want to have a predisposition to the quality of the conversation, that it will be valuable. I also want to have a predisposition to being changed through the conversation, that while we talk, I'll become something that I wasn't before, that I don't have all the answers. I have a set of experiences through my life as a pastor and as a dad and as a husband and as a friend and as a neighbor and as an entrepreneur and everything else. And many of them amazing and many of them really hard and really wounding. And I think that mix, what I hope that it opens me up to learning how to be better at all those things, learning how to be a more tender father and a more committed husband and a more creative entrepreneur and a more attentive pastor and a more valuable counselor and everything else. And I think that in order to walk into a space and be changed through it, I think I have to recognize that I've got things that need to change, right? And I think that's what we mean when we say humility.
Sweet laugh, big heart, a smile that could light up the dark. Strong faith, close family, choosing love in the midst of tragedy. When I met you.
Yeah, I would just say the humility is, for me, that I hope to be present. One is that I hope remains reflected throughout our conversations is that kind of willingness. I'll start with the bigger picture of an assumption that we're not trying to offer final answers and bold pronouncements, and so that's a willingness to change. It's also in the conversation, it's a willingness to offer. I think it takes audacity and also humility to offer into that space a gesture toward processing or forming an answer out loud, right?
Mm-hmm.
for other people to consider as we talk and work things out. And so, that our response or our conversation may begin with, I don't know, but here's what I'm thinking. So I think that there's an audacity in that, and hopefully a humility in that acknowledges that we realize that the conversation isn't final. It's not intended to be final, but more so, more formative.
Yeah.
And a part of the process of growing. I would add that when you asked me if I would do this, for me, I said yes, not so much because I wanted to do a podcast, but because
Right.
but because of our friendship.
Yeah.
And because we'll tell our stories in the upcoming podcast episodes, which have certainly have given rise, I think, to this moment where we're doing this podcast. And so out of my own story, our friendship has been formative in my story. And that goes back to conversations we were having 15 years ago that were these kinds of conversations. And then, then after a particular significant event in my life, you and I talked essentially once a week. And the reason we were able to do that is because of our friendship and your ability to hold space for very, very difficult conversations. And you were able to hold space for me to sort of be off the map, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in those conversations with you, I never felt like when I was, off the map. I always felt like you were able to, you talk to me out of your knowledge of me over the course of our friendship, never out of what maybe crazy thing I was saying, or crazy might not be the right way to say it. But the thing that I was saying that maybe in your own mind, you thought, I know this is not where he's going to land. But this is what he's feeling right now. And you allowed that to be. And so the value of that kind of space provided for humans to be and to be honest and to say things that very likely are not going to be the final conclusion,
right?
What that person thinks has been an extremely valuable gift to me as a person and as your friend. And so I think if the podcast can model that to any degree, and I think about this, and I don't want to narrow this down, but I think about it because that's where I come from and that's where it makes sense to me. I think about that in terms of my lifelong experience in the church, where that seems rare. I don't want to say it doesn't exist.
Sure.
But it seems and feels rare to have that kind of space provided to process out loud, honestly, and really slowly, and sometimes acutely, right?
Yeah.
And so I think if our conversations together could invite anyone else to consider that there's a space for their wandering, right?
Yeah.
And I say that thinking of Tolkien's quote that all who wander are not lost, right?
Right.
That wandering is not necessarily that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's and so to me, that I think that the humility that I would like to see is a humility that continues to provide that kind of space and invite others to consider that there are safe places for them
Yeah.
as well to have conversation.
There was actually something that I heard you say a number of times when I was asking you a question or heard somebody else asking you a question, which the expectation for the answer was a binary. It's either yes or no. The question is this: do you think this is true? And the answer is clearly supposed to be either yes or no. And you would say, well, I don't know, but I hope so. I don't know, but I hope it's true. And what that did for me was it opened up a third category within discourse. There's the affirmative category, there's the negative category, and then there's the kind of aspirational category, right? Mm-hmm. Which is to say, I don't know the answer to the question, but here's what I hope it is. And to insert that into the discourse as a appropriate and valuable part of the conversation. Not just, do you think it's true or not true, but what do you hope is true? What do you hope is not true? Because what that does is it actually a conversation in which the answer is given in a binary actually exonerates me from being personally involved in the conversation. But a conversation that inserts this third category of the aspirational, I actually have to bring my interior life into that conversation, right? And so in some ways, don't hold me to this, is a riskier kind of conversation. Mm-hmm. It's riskier because what it does is it puts all of our hopes on the line. It puts our hopes out in public, and if there's a place where I've experienced real social embarrassment, it's been in saying my hopes out loud. And so I think I want the conversations to be risk-free in that none of us are held to these conversations as with the character of a conclusion, and that this will mark us out for the rest of our lives. But I want the conversations to be even riskier than that. I want them to be riskier in that we actually bring our interior lives. We say, here's the things that we hope for, and here's the things that I'm afraid of. If I believe this thing, I'm afraid it'll mean this. If I hope for this thing, I'm afraid that it'll mean that. And that's the kind of conversation that I feel like is maybe more shot through with humanity, with deep connection. That's the kind of conversation I think that actually makes a world, at least a world worth living in.
Yeah, because the only way I know how to do that, or I've learned to do that, I think even more because of deep grief, and trauma, but also through even processing those things in my life, realizing that I've always, as an Enneagram 4, I've always had this deep sense of longing.
Yeah.
Always, of the magic of the world. I can remember, I was telling my therapist last week, we just watched A Christmas Story. I wanted to say Toy Story, and I know that's not right. A Christmas Story.
Yeah.
And what's so brilliant about that, I don't know what the percentages are, but that was my life. That his sort of his imagination and fantasy world, and that his theme was going to get an A plus 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 plus, and all that was, I look at that and I was like, that was me. I lived in that kind of space where I dreamt and longed and imagined and had this world that slowly gets, shut down, right? By whatever. So I think that people who are well acquainted with grief need to know there's aspirational categories. aspirational category to conversation
Yeah.
and answer. And people who have deep longing and desire and imagination need to know that there's also aspirational category to the questions they have.
Yeah.
Or at least there's space. Those things get invited should be invited into the conversation.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is what it's going to be like. I don't know if this is what the new heavens and new earth is going to be like, but I hope so.
Yeah.
If we can't say that out loud, then that does feel humanizing and soul killing to me.
Yep. I would love, Shana, for you to reflect on who you hope listens. Like, who do you think the podcast is for?
Well, I mean, so in the realm of Christians, I hope that there are Christians who have felt like their voices, their questions, their griefs, or their longings, that the Christian world just at best can only shunt them to the side for some other higher thing. That those things are actually, they're integral, not incidental to their spiritual health and well-being. And the podcast would be a kind of invitation to enter that space of audacity and humility with God. That actually to believe that God invites us into this space.
Yeah.
And then for those who don't identify as Christian in any way, that maybe there could be in our conversations an invitation to at least see Christianity maybe at least differently than the cultural paradigm and caricature. And when I say caricature, I think a lot of Christian churches live the caricature in a lot of ways. I think
there's a reason why it's there.
Yeah, so that maybe, if nothing else, and in that, maybe just consider what I say, what I've said before it was in a homily at a funeral that was very mixed, and who was there, and as I work through the scriptural passage, what I wanted to do and what I said out loud is I hope this at least invites you to consider that if this is what Jesus is really like, then there's something compelling here. There's something compelling about it, a Jesus who weeps at the grave of his friend, and or at least to see why I find it compelling, right? That there's a God who in his love for the world wept at the death of a friend, and who delights in the guys working the forklift unloading shingles from a flatbed truck, right? That as we talk about the beauties and the sorrows of this life, that maybe there will be things that that others find compelling about a God who would value those things, and in the ways we're trying to consider. I mean, I think about Thomas Halleck's
Patience with God.
Patience with God? Yeah, maybe it's the Zacchaeuses who are looking on from the fringes and are not interested in the crowd. They're not welcomed in the crowd. Actually, they're disinvited. Have decidedly disinvited from being in the crowd, but are willing to at least kind of strain their neck to consider if this Jesus character is really the real deal.
It makes me think about even the kind of metaphorical, the kind of spatial metaphor that we're using when we're talking about the crowd, the circle, and the fringes. Because it seems like if we can learn anything from the kind of consistent surprise baked into the stories of Jesus, it's that we're not very good at identifying where is the center and where are the fringes of the circle. And that more often than not, the fringes are closer to the middle than we thought, right? And
because
maybe
Jesus makes that so, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Jesus refuses to accept our construction of center and fringes.
And I think that's right. And I think for me, I want the podcast to be for the people who are similarly unsatisfied with where we've identified the center and the edges of the circle. In a lot of my pastoral counseling, I'm faced with people who have self-identified as no longer Christians because they have a life that's kind of shot through with doubt. And they were told at some point, maybe explicitly, maybe implicitly, that faith and doubt are opposed to each other. Right. So that faith and certainty are the same thing. And I'd be honored if the audience was full of people who need to hear that faith and doubt can exist together, that faith and certainty are not the same thing, and that doubt might actually be a deep expression of faith.
Don't Hold Me to This podcast is a production of Don't Hold Me to This. You can find out more, do some more reading, and get in touch at don'tholdmetothis.com, no apostrophe.